Rain drifted across the windshield, a curtain of silver blurring the lights of downtown Seattle. The late rush-hour traffic had thinned, leaving only the sound of tires cutting through wet asphalt. Michael Dawson loosened his tie as the wipers swept rhythmically, his mind somewhere between the day's board meetings and the quiet emptiness waiting at home. He preferred driving himself on nights like this. No chauffeur, no conference calls, just the steady hum of the rain and the illusion of solitude. As he turned onto a narrow street near Capitol Hill, a flicker of movement caught his eye. A young woman stood at the bus stop, clutching her side, her umbrella twisting in the wind. Before he could process what he saw, she stumbled forward and collapsed onto the slick pavement. Instinct overtook thought. Michael braked hard, his car skidding slightly before stopping. He rushed out into the rain. "Hey, are you all right?" he shouted, crouching beside her. Her skin was cold and clammy, her breath shallow. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. The name tag on her worn bag read N. Brooks. Without thinking twice, Michael lifted her carefully into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, frighteningly so. He placed her in the back seat, slammed the door shut, and sped toward Providence Medical Center. The emergency room lights hit him like daylight after darkness. Nurses swarmed around as he carried the unconscious girl inside. "Appendicitis," one of them murmured after a quick check. "She's lucky you brought her in now. A few more minutes, and it might have ruptured." Michael exhaled for what felt like the first time in hours. He stood there, soaked, watching as they wheeled her away through swinging doors. The sterile smell of disinfectant brought back memories he'd buried for 2 decades, memories that never truly stayed buried. He found himself in the waiting room, sitting beneath the dull hum of fluorescent lights. The girl's backpack lay beside him. Through the thin fabric, he could see the outline of a few papers, a worn photo frame, and a law textbook with sticky notes along the edges. Something about her stirred a strange ache in his chest. The auburn strands of her hair, the curve of her cheekbone, the delicate line of her jaw, he had seen them before. Isabel. The name slipped into his mind like a whisper from the past. Isabel Dawson. His wife. Gone 20 years, but never gone from him. He had loved her with a kind of devotion that didn't fade. It only changed shape, hardening into silence. He closed his eyes and was back there, the hospital room, the smell of antiseptic, the tremor in his hands as he held hers. Isabel's voice had been faint but calm. "Promise me, Michael, if she's alive, find her." He had nodded, choking back tears, but the doctors said the baby didn't survive the surgery. A stillbirth. A tragedy no one questioned. Yet for years he'd searched. He questioned nurses, hired investigators, followed rumors that led nowhere. The trail always ended in the same dead end, a single line on a report, female infant deceased at birth. But even then, something inside him refused to believe. The way Isabel's eyes had lingered before she slipped away, as if she knew something he didn't. The faint cry he thought he'd heard down the corridor before the doctor told him it was over. Michael rubbed his temples, trying to shake off the thought. He looked up when a nurse approached. "She's stable," she said. "You got her here just in time. We'll keep her overnight." He nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." As the nurse walked away, Michael found himself staring through the glass partition into the recovery room. The girl, Natalie Brooks, lay asleep, her breathing slow, her face pale against the white sheets. A small scar crossed her collarbone, just below where the hospital gown fell away. It wasn't important, but his gaze lingered anyway. Outside, the rain kept falling, tracing quiet rivers down the window. In that reflection, Michael saw 2 faces, his own, tired and lined by time, and hers, young and unfamiliar, yet heartbreakingly familiar all at once. He didn't know why, but something deep inside told him this moment mattered. He just didn't know yet how much. He turned away only when the intercom called another code down the hall. The echo of Isabel's voice lingered in his memory, tethered to a promise he'd never been able to keep. And as the rain washed over Seattle that night, Michael Dawson sat alone in the waiting room, unaware that the life he'd just saved was the very one he'd been searching for all these years. The hallway outside the operating room smelled of antiseptic and rain-soaked earth drifting in through a cracked window. Michael Dawson stood motionless, his palms pressed against the cold glass, watching as nurses hurried past in streaks of white and blue. He'd been there for hours, waiting, pacing, praying, but now the world had narrowed to a single, suffocating silence. The surgeon emerged at last, removing his gloves with mechanical precision. His voice was flat when he spoke. "Mr. Dawson, your wife didn't make it. We did everything we could. I'm sorry." Michael blinked once, unable to process the words. "And the baby?" The pause that followed was crueler than any answer. "Stillborn," the doctor murmured. "There were complications, severe hemorrhaging. The infant couldn't be saved." Michael heard the explanation, but not the meaning. The hallway swayed around him, and someone tried to guide him toward a chair. He refused. He walked straight into the recovery ward, ignoring the nurse's protest. Isabel lay there beneath a thin white sheet, her skin the color of paper. Her hand, still warm, slipped easily into his. He kissed her forehead and whispered words that no one else could hear. "I promised you forever," he said. "And you promised me a daughter." Her eyes never opened again. Days blurred together after that. The funeral came and went, a blur of faces, flowers, and voices offering condolences that sounded like static. Michael stopped hearing them. What kept echoing in his mind was the sound of Isabel's breathing in that last hour. The tremor in her voice when she said, "If she's alive, find her." He tried. God, he tried. He met with the attending nurse, a woman named Valerie. She looked at him with rehearsed sympathy and repeated the official story. The baby was delivered stillborn, immediately transferred to pathology, cremation arranged. She couldn't show him the report because the paperwork was still being filed. Her eyes darted too quickly when she spoke. Michael wasn't satisfied. He asked about the woman who had shared Isabel's room, the one who had gone into labor the same night. Valerie hesitated, then scribbled a name on a piece of paper, Helen Grant. But when Michael went to the address the next day, the apartment was empty. Neighbors said the woman had moved out that morning, leaving no forwarding information. He started hiring private investigators, 2, then 3. They searched hospital records, adoption agencies, even morgue files. Nothing. Each lead ended with the same verdict. No surviving infant registered under that name. The phrase repeated like a curse. Weeks turned into months, his house filled with unopened mail, and the whiskey bottles lined up like silent sentinels across his kitchen counter. His son, Ryan, only 5 at the time, began staying with Michael's parents because his father was too broken to care for him. Eric Holden, Michael's oldest friend and business partner, came by almost daily. He forced Michael to eat, to shower, to show up at work if only for an hour. "You still have Ryan," Eric reminded him. "He needs you." But Michael's mind lived elsewhere, in the echo of a heartbeat that might never have existed, in the memory of Isabel's hand going still in his. At night, when the city outside his window blurred into streaks of light, he would whisper the same promise he'd made at her bedside. "If she's alive, I'll find her." Years passed, but the words didn't fade. They became a refrain, a pulse beneath every deal he signed, every meeting he attended, every birthday Ryan celebrated. His success grew, but so did the emptiness. No matter how many zeros appeared in his bank account, he still saw that hospital hallway every time it rained. And somewhere, deep down, beneath logic and loss, Michael Dawson never stopped believing that the child they said had died was still out there, waiting to be found. Natalie Brooks had learned early that life rarely gave second chances. The sound of sirens from that winter night still haunted her, the one when headlights blurred across an icy road and her parents' car never made it home. She was 16, sitting in the back seat of a friend's car when the call came from the hospital. By the time she arrived, the hallway lights had already dimmed, and two covered bodies lay side by side under white sheets. In one night, her world dissolved into paperwork and condolences. The state appointed a guardian, Philip Crane, her father's former financial advisor. At first, he seemed kind, efficient, comforting in the way adults could be when they wanted your trust. He managed the estate, signed the forms, promised to take care of her college fund. For a while, she believed him. But by the time she turned 18, the trust was empty. The accounts reallocated, and every lawyer she called said the same thing. Without proof of misconduct, there's nothing we can do. Philip always smiled when he saw her struggle. Life's expensive, Natalie, he'd say. You'll understand when you're older. He lived in a gated house overlooking Lake Union, while she rented a one-bedroom apartment in a crumbling building with peeling paint and flickering hall lights. To survive, she pieced together a life out of exhaustion. 2 part-time jobs, tutoring at night, weekend shifts at a diner. Every dollar went toward tuition for her law degree, a desperate attempt to understand the system that had failed her. Sometimes, when she passed the courthouse, she imagined standing in front of a judge, forcing men like Philip Crane to look her in the eye and answer for what they'd done. But the real world was colder than her dreams. The Seattle rain fell harder each year, and the city didn't notice another tired student walking home under a broken umbrella. Still, there was something that kept her moving forward, a memory she couldn't quite let go of, a night years ago when a stranger had stopped to help her. She had been 17, feverish and alone at a bus stop, pain tearing through her side. A man had pulled over, carried her to a hospital, and stayed until she was stable. She never knew his name, only that he'd saved her life. Sometimes she wondered if she'd imagined his kindness. Years later, while scrolling through job listings, a company name caught her eye, Dawson Technologies. The name pulled something loose in her memory, like a forgotten chord. She searched it online and froze when she saw his photo on the company website, Michael Dawson, CEO. The same eyes, the same calm presence she remembered through the haze of hospital lights. Her hands trembled as she drafted the email. Dear Mr. Dawson, I doubt you remember me, but years ago you helped a stranger outside Seattle. That stranger was me. I've since finished law school, and I'm searching for work in your field. I would be grateful for any advice or a chance to prove myself. She read it 3 times before hitting send, expecting nothing. But 2 days later, his assistant called. Michael wanted to meet her in person. When she walked into his office, glass walls framing the gray skyline, he stood from behind his desk and smiled, a faint, searching smile. Natalie Brooks, he said softly, as if testing the name. I do remember. Something unspoken passed between them. It wasn't romance, and it wasn't familiarity. It was a quiet pull neither could explain. He offered her a position that same afternoon, a junior legal assistant role. That night, Natalie sat in her apartment, staring at the offer letter. For the first time in years, she felt a fragile kind of hope. She didn't know why he'd remembered her, or why his gaze seemed to hold questions he couldn't ask. But deep down, she sensed that this job, this man, would change everything. Outside her window, the rain returned, tapping gently against the glass. And for the first time since she was 16, Natalie Brooks didn't feel entirely alone. The elevator doors slid open with a polished chime, and Ryan Dawson stepped into the lobby of Dawson Technologies with the confidence of someone who had never failed at anything in his life. Fresh from Stanford's business program, he wore his success like a tailored suit, impeccable, precise, and deliberate. Employees greeted him with polite smiles as he passed, and he returned each nod with the faint acknowledgement of someone already accustomed to command. Michael had built the company from a small startup into a respected name in Seattle's tech scene. But Ryan saw it as an empire waiting for modernization, and for him to inherit. His return was supposed to mark a new chapter, a generational handoff of vision and power. But from the moment he stepped into his father's office, he sensed that something had shifted. Michael looked lighter somehow. The perpetual tension that had shadowed him for years had softened, and when a young woman entered with a folder in hand, Ryan noticed the change immediately, the way his father's tone eased, the quiet warmth in his expression. "Ryan, this is Natalie Brooks," Michael said, standing. "Our new legal assistant. She's been a tremendous help these past few weeks." Natalie smiled politely and extended her hand. "It's nice to finally meet you. Your father talks about you often." Ryan shook her hand, his expression cordial but guarded. She was poised and professional, maybe a few years younger than him. With calm eyes that gave nothing away, he offered a practiced smile before turning back to his father. "Glad to hear things are running smoothly." But that evening, as he reviewed company files in the executive lounge, Ryan couldn't ignore what he'd seen. The subtle familiarity between them, the quiet ease that had replaced the usual distance in Michael's demeanor. His father hadn't trusted anyone this way in decades, and certainly not a recent hire. Over the next few days he watched. Natalie's desk was near the glass wall outside Michael's office. They shared brief conversations, sometimes laughter. Michael invited her to strategy meetings, usually reserved for senior staff. To anyone else, it might have looked harmless, mentorship, perhaps gratitude. But Ryan saw manipulation. He confronted Eric Holden one afternoon after a board session. "You've noticed it too, haven't you?" Eric looked up from his notes. "Noticed what?" "Natalie," Ryan said. "She's too close. Dad's treating her like family. And she's been here, 3 weeks?" Eric's tone stayed measured. "Your father's capable of knowing who to trust." Ryan gave a sharp laugh. "He's also been lonely for 20 years. People like her can sense that. She probably saw his name, knew his reputation, and found her way in. It happens every day." Eric didn't argue, but his gaze lingered on Ryan longer than usual. Something in the young man's voice, a mix of resentment and protectiveness, echoed an old wound. That night, Ryan opened his laptop and began drafting an email to a private investigator he'd used once before. Discreet background check. Subject, Natalie Brooks. Focus on education. Family history, criminal record, prior employment. I want a full report within 2 weeks. He hit send without hesitation. Across town, Eric Holden sat alone in his study, nursing a glass of scotch. Ryan's paranoia troubled him, but something else had caught his attention. The way Natalie's birthday matched the same year, almost the same month, as the daughter Michael had lost. Coincidence, perhaps, but Eric had known Michael long enough to recognize the signs, the way he looked at her, the unspoken ache in his eyes when she laughed. By the next morning, Eric had already made a few quiet calls of his own, pulling hospital records, cross-referencing adoption files, not because he believed Ryan's suspicions, but because, for the first time in 2 decades, he dared to wonder whether fate might finally be undoing the lie that had shattered his friend's life. Meanwhile, in the office across the hall, Natalie worked late, unaware that her name now existed in 2 separate investigations, one driven by doubt and the other by hope. The rain tapped gently against the glass, and beyond the city lights, the past began to stir. The office had emptied long before midnight, leaving only the quiet hum of the HVAC and the faint flicker of screensavers across the open floor. Outside, Seattle's skyline shimmered through the rain, reflections rippling like ghosts in the glass. Natalie Brooks sat at her desk, typing out the final draft of a contract. She liked working late, fewer interruptions, fewer eyes watching her every move. Except tonight, someone else had stayed behind, burning the midnight oil again. Ryan Dawson's voice broke the silence. He leaned against the doorway of the legal department, his suit jacket unbuttoned, tie loosened just enough to suggest a practiced charm. Natalie forced a polite smile. Just wrapping up the merger file. Mr. Dawson wanted the revisions by morning. He stepped inside, hands in his pockets. You know you don't have to call me that. Ryan's fine. I prefer keeping things professional, she said, eyes fixed on the screen. He chuckled, circling behind her desk. Professional, right. His tone carried amusement, but underneath it, something colder. You've made quite an impression around here, you know. My father can't stop praising you. That doesn't happen often. Natalie kept typing. He's been kind. I just try to do my job. Ryan leaned closer, his reflection hovering over hers in the monitor. He's more than kind. You should be careful with that. When men like him take an interest in someone, people start talking. Her fingers stilled. Excuse me. He smiled, lowering his voice. I'm just saying, you're ambitious and that's fine. But be smart about whose attention you're using. The words hit her like a slap. She turned, eyes sharp. I don't know what you think you're implying, but you're out of line. Ryan shrugged, feigning innocence. Relax. I'm just looking out for you. She stood, gathering her files. I don't need your advice, Mr. Dawson. He watched her leave, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. Over the next week, the tension grew. Ryan's comments became subtler but more invasive. Compliments that weren't quite compliments, questions that probed too deeply. He began stopping by her desk under the guise of mentorship, lingering just a moment too long. Natalie did everything she could to avoid him. Lunches at her desk, taking the stairs instead of the elevator, leaving right after Michael. But late nights were part of the job, and sometimes there was no escaping him. One Friday evening, the office lights dimmed to half power as the janitor made his rounds. Natalie stayed late to prepare documents for Monday's board meeting. She was focused, lost in the rhythm of typing, when she heard the click of polished shoes behind her. Working late again. Ryan's voice was softer this time, almost teasing. She didn't turn. You shouldn't be here. I could say the same, he murmured, stepping closer. You know, you don't have to keep proving yourself. You're already impressive. Ryan, please. He reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from her shoulder. Relax, Natalie. She flinched away. Don't. The smile dropped from his face. In one sudden motion, he caught her wrist, his voice low and urgent. You think you're better than everyone? My father, the staff me? You play the perfect little victim while you make him fall for you. Let go, she said, struggling against his grip. Instead, he leaned in and tried to kiss her. Natalie shoved him with all her strength. His back hit the edge of the desk, knocking over a glass of water. She stepped back, her chest heaving. If you ever touch me again, she whispered, I'll make sure everyone knows what you are. Then she turned and ran, past the elevator, down the stairwell, into the cold rain outside. She didn't stop until she reached her apartment, her breath ragged, hand shaking as she locked the door behind her. The tears came only then, silent and relentless. The next morning, she arrived at the office early. A single envelope waited on Michael Dawson's desk. Inside, her resignation letter. When Michael found it, his chest tightened. He called her immediately, but the line went to voicemail. Then he called Ryan. His son entered the office a few minutes later, shoulders squared, eyes avoiding his father's. Michael didn't speak at first. He simply stood, his expression unreadable. Did you do something to her? Ryan hesitated. It's not what you think. The sound of the slap was sharp, echoing through the glass-walled office. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Ryan's cheek burned red. Michael's hand trembled. You've shamed this family, Michael said, voice shaking. You've shamed me. Years of unspoken resentment boiled to the surface. Grief, guilt, disappointment. "You've never trusted me," Ryan spat. "You always looked at me like I wasn't enough. And now, because of her, you finally find a reason to care." Michael's voice broke. She was the first person in years who reminded me of what decency looks like. Ryan turned away, but his face was pale, his eyes hollow. For the first time, he realized his father's anger came not from pride, but from heartbreak. The silence between them was heavier than words. It was the sound of something cracking, not just a relationship, but the illusion that either of them truly understood the other. And as Michael stood alone in his office after Ryan left, the echo of that single slap lingered like thunder long after the storm had passed. Natalie sat cross-legged on the floor of her apartment, surrounded by the quiet disarray of open boxes and the faint scent of dust and lavender. It had been 3 days since she'd left Dawson Technologies, 3 days of restless pacing, unanswered calls, and the echo of Ryan's voice replaying in her head. Tonight, she decided to face the one thing she had avoided since her mother's death, the boxes she had never opened. They had come from the storage unit in Tacoma. Marked personal effects, Marjorie Brooks. Her mother's handwriting was still elegant even on the masking tape. Natalie slid it open carefully, half afraid of what she might find. Inside were small, ordinary things: a photo album, folded scarves, the faint scent of perfume still clinging to the fabric. Beneath a stack of medical papers, her fingers brushed something solid, a small wooden box, sealed with a brittle piece of tape. Her heart thudded as she peeled it away. Inside was an envelope yellowed by time. Her mother's name written in trembling ink. "To my daughter, when you are ready to know the truth." Natalie unfolded the letter with shaking hands. "My dearest child, you must think of me with anger when you read this, and I deserve it. Years ago, I did something that cannot be undone. You were not born to me. I took you from a hospital the night a woman died giving birth. She was beautiful and kind, and I was broken. My own baby had died hours before. I held you when they left you unattended, and I couldn't let go. I told myself it was fate, that God had given me another chance. But deep down I knew it was theft. The woman's husband was still there. He never knew the truth. I loved you as my own, but I have lived every day waiting for the day this sin would find me." Natalie's hands trembled so hard she could barely hold the page. The words blurred through her tears. She reread the lines again and again, trying to understand how her entire life could be built on someone else's grief. Her mind raced back to the hospital records she'd once seen among her mother's files, documents with dates that never quite matched her birth certificate. The timing, the city, the hospital name, it all aligned too perfectly. She pressed a hand to her mouth. Could I be that stolen child? The thought made her stomach turn. She wanted to dismiss it, but a strange intuition told her the letter wasn't a lie. The kindness in Michael Dawson's eyes, the familiarity she couldn't explain, it all came flooding back. Her rational mind kicked in. She needed proof. The letter wasn't enough. She dug through her drawer for an old home DNA test kit she'd once ordered as a curiosity, never used. Now it felt like destiny. She filled out the form, swabbed her cheek, sealed the envelope, and scheduled express shipping. The results would take a week to learn whether her entire identity was a lie. Outside, the rain started again, tapping faintly on the windows. Natalie sat in silence, clutching the letter to her chest, the words "I took you" echoing louder than the thunder. Across the city, in his penthouse overlooking the Sound, Ryan Dawson poured himself a drink. His jaw still carried the faint bruise from his father's slap. Every sip of whiskey burned, but not as much as the humiliation. He stared at the photo of Natalie still saved in the company's internal directory. The woman who had come from nowhere, who had stolen his father's attention, his trust. "Let's see how perfect you really are," he muttered. He opened his laptop and copied a folder marked Confidential Meridian Merger. He attached it to an anonymous email, addressed to Dawson Technologies' chief competitor. A few keystrokes later, the message was gone, sent from an untraceable account. "Let's see how Dad feels when his little protege destroys his company," he whispered to himself. The city lights flickered across his glass, and for a moment his reflection looked unfamiliar, tired, bitter, and small. Somewhere across town, Natalie sealed the DNA envelope and placed it by the door for pickup, unaware that by morning, her name would be at the center of a scandal that would undo everything she'd fought to rebuild. The boardroom felt colder than usual, as though the walls themselves had absorbed the tension. A week had passed since Natalie mailed her DNA sample, and her nerves had been raw ever since. Each morning, she opened her inbox with trembling fingers, waiting for results that could either rewrite her life or destroy the little piece she had left. But tonight, the message she received wasn't from the lab. It was a company-wide memo, confidential information leaked to Meridian Systems. Internal investigation underway. By the time she arrived at Dawson Technologies, whispers were already circulating. The new merger proposal, something she had spent weeks drafting, had appeared in the hands of a rival firm. There was no proof, just rumors, and every look that followed her down the hall carried quiet suspicion. When Michael summoned her to his office, she could feel the judgment waiting. He stood by the window, his posture rigid, hands clasped behind his back. "Close the door," he said quietly. She did. "Mr. Dawson, I heard about the leak." "I swear I had nothing to," he turned sharply. "Then how do you explain this?" He held up a printed email chain from the IT department. Attached was a file sent from her company account to an external address, an address tied to Meridian Systems. Her breath caught. "That's not possible." "I didn't. Someone must have, Natalie." His tone softened for a fleeting moment before turning hard again. "I trusted you. I defended you when others doubted your place here. And now this." Her throat tightened. "Please, just let me prove it wasn't me." He shook his head, weary rather than angry. "The board is furious. I have no choice." Those 4 words landed heavier than any accusation. "I have no choice. I'll clear my name," she said, voice trembling. "But I won't beg you to believe me." She left the room, quietly, her footsteps muffled against the carpet. Her resignation letter, already drafted days earlier, waited in her bag. She placed it on his desk along with a smaller envelope unmarked. Inside were the DNA test results she'd received that morning, but hadn't yet had the courage to open. She didn't need to read them. She already knew what they would say. As she walked out of the building, Eric Holden caught sight of her in the hallway. "Natalie." "Wait, what happened?" She managed a broken smile. "It's over, Mr. Holden." Tell him thank you," he called after her. But the elevator doors closed before he could reach her. Moments later, Ryan entered Michael's office, hiding a smirk behind forced concern. "She's gone." Michael didn't answer. He sat at his desk, staring at the unopened envelope Natalie had left behind. Ryan crossed his arms. "I warned you she was trouble." The older man's gaze snapped up, sharp and cold. "Enough." But as Ryan turned to leave, something shifted in his expression. The satisfaction drained away, replaced by guilt that had been festering since the night of the leak. Eric's voice echoed in his head from earlier that week, an offhand comment about conscience, about lines that couldn't be uncrossed. Ryan froze, then exhaled shakily. "Dad," Michael looked up, waiting. "It wasn't her." His words came out rough, choked. "The files, I sent them. I just wanted you to see who she really was. I never thought it would go that far." For a long moment, Michael didn't move. Then Eric, who had entered quietly behind them, spoke in a low, measured voice. "He's telling the truth, Michael." IT confirmed the timestamp. It wasn't Natalie's account. It was his credentials spoofed through hers. Michael's face drained of color. He reached for the envelope on his desk, the one Natalie had left behind. When he unfolded the paper inside, the words blurred through his tears. DNA test result. 99.9% probability of biological relation, Michael Dawson, father. The letter slipped from his hands. The office, the company, the past 20 years. All of it tilted in one dizzying rush. Ryan stared at the paper, then at his father, horror spreading across his face. "She's your daughter?" Michael didn't answer. His silence said enough. Eric placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "You have to find her, Michael, before she disappears for good." Outside, rain streaked the glass, washing the city in blurred reflections. Inside, the truth finally shattered the illusion holding them all together. And for the first time in 2 decades, Michael Dawson realized that the promise he'd made in a hospital room long ago had come back to demand fulfillment. Michael sat alone in his office, the city stretching before him in streaks of rain and fading light. The envelope Natalie had left still lay unopened on his desk, its edges slightly damp from where his hands had rested too long. Eric's words echoed in his mind, blurring with Ryan's broken confession. The walls felt smaller, the air heavier. For 20 years he had dreamed of this moment, proof that the baby he'd lost might still exist. But never like this, never wrapped in shame and guilt. His fingers trembled as he tore the envelope open. Inside, the paper was plain, clinical, numbers, names, and one undeniable line. 99.9% probability of biological relationship. Michael Dawson, father. He sank back into his chair, the world falling silent. The hum of the city disappeared, replaced by a low ringing in his ears. Memories crashed through him. Isabel's final breath, her hand clutching his. The promise he'd whispered beside her hospital bed. "If she's alive, I'll find her." He had found her, and he had destroyed her. Across the room, Ryan stood frozen near the doorway, his face pale, eyes fixed on the paper in his father's hand. "She's your daughter?" His voice cracked on the word. Michael looked up, his eyes hollow. "Yes." Ryan staggered back, as if struck. "Oh my God!" His mind reeled. Images of the office that night, her terrified face, his hands on her wrists. "I didn't know. Dad, I didn't know." Michael's voice was low, but sharp enough to cut the air. "You nearly ruined her life, Ryan." And he broke off, unable to finish. "I let her walk out thinking she was nothing to me." He pushed back from his chair, moving toward the door. "We have to find her." Eric, who had been standing quietly near the hall, nodded. "I already checked her apartment. She's gone. The landlord said she left this morning with 2 suitcases. No forwarding address." Michael ran a hand through his hair. "She has to be somewhere. Friends, relatives, anyone." "She didn't have anyone," Eric said softly. "I looked into her file months ago, remember? No close family, no emergency contacts. She's been on her own her entire life." Ryan's breathing quickened. "It's my fault. She left because of me." Michael turned on him, fury flickering beneath his grief. "This isn't about fault anymore. It's about fixing what's left." Eric stepped between them, calm but firm. "Then start now. The longer you wait, the further she'll go. I can reach out to a few people, contacts in law firms. Maybe track her through her student records." Michael nodded, gripping the edge of his desk for support. He was shaking, not from anger, but from the weight of everything collapsing at once. "Find her, Eric. Please." As Eric left to make the calls, Ryan lingered in the doorway, his face streaked with guilt. "What do I do?" he whispered. Michael looked at him, eyes filled with a sorrow that went deeper than disappointment. "You live with it," he said quietly, "and you help me bring her home." Outside, the storm intensified. Lightning flashed across the skyline, followed by the low rumble of thunder rolling over Puget Sound. In that moment, Michael Dawson stood at the window, watching the rain slide down the glass. each drop carrying a piece of the life he had failed to protect. Somewhere beyond the storm, his daughter was out there, alone, lost, and carrying the same blood that had cursed them both. And as the night deepened, Seattle became a city of ghosts, one searching, one hiding, and one haunted by the unbearable truth that love, too, could destroy. A month had passed since Natalie's disappearance, though for Michael Dawson, time had dissolved into a blur of sleepless nights and unanswered calls. The private investigators found nothing. No credit card activity, no forwarding address. No trace of her in Seattle or anywhere nearby. He began to wonder if fate was punishing him twice for the same sin. First for losing her, and now for driving her away. It was Ryan who stumbled upon the lead. He was in Portland for a conference, half trying to escape his father's silence, half drowning his guilt in routine. At a cafe near the waterfront, he ran into an old college friend, Dylan Carter, who greeted him with the ease of someone who hadn't heard the gossip swirling around Seattle. They talked over coffee, small talk, sports, work. Then Dylan mentioned something that made Ryan's chest seize. "I've been seeing this girl lately. Smart, quiet type. Law background, I think. Name's Natalie. She's been living with my grandma since she moved here. Sweet kid, but there's something sad about her, you know." Ryan froze. "Natalie?" he asked carefully. "Natalie Brooks." Dylan blinked. "Yeah, you know her." Ryan's coffee went cold in his hand. He mumbled something about needing to make a call and left without finishing his drink. Within 3 hours, he was back in Seattle. When he told his father, Michael stood completely still, as if afraid to breathe. "Where?" he whispered. "Portland, near Lake Oswego. She's been staying with an old woman, Dylan's grandmother." Michael grabbed his coat. "We leave tonight." The drive down I-5 was wordless. Rain followed them like a shadow, and every mile brought back memories Michael couldn't escape. Isabel's last words, Natalie's laughter in the office, the look in her eyes when she realized he didn't believe her. Ryan sat beside him, silent, ashamed. He had offered to stay behind, but Michael had insisted he come. Some wounds had to be faced together. They arrived at dawn. The lake was wrapped in morning fog, the world muted except for the slow lap of water against the shore. Dylan's grandmother, a kind-eyed woman in a knitted shawl, opened the door before they could knock twice. "She's out back," she said softly. "She spends her mornings by the water." Michael stepped onto the small deck overlooking the lake. Natalie sat near the edge, her hair caught in the wind, a mug of tea warming her hands. When she turned and saw him, the cup slipped from her grasp and shattered on the wooden planks. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Michael crossed the distance between them and fell to his knees before her, his face breaking beneath years of restraint. "I kept my promise to your mother," he whispered. "I found you. I just didn't know it was you until it was too late." Natalie's lips trembled, tears catching in her lashes. She tried to speak, but her voice failed. He reached for her hand, and she didn't pull away. "You were never lost," he said. "Only hidden from me." Behind them, Ryan lingered by the porch steps, unable to move closer. When he finally did, he dropped to one knee beside them, his voice raw. "I don't expect forgiveness. What I did, I'll never undo. But I needed you to know how sorry I am." Natalie looked at him for a long, searching moment. "I forgave you the day I left," she said quietly. "Not for you, but because I had to survive it." Ryan bowed his head, tears sliding down his face. Michael pulled her into his arms, holding her as though she might vanish again. The fog began to lift, revealing the still water beneath a rising sun. For the first time in 20 years, the air around Michael felt lighter, as though Isabel herself were standing somewhere nearby watching. And though Natalie's eyes still carried sorrow, there was something new in them, peace, fragile but real, like morning light breaking through after a long, endless storm. Several months later, The rhythm of life in Seattle had begun to settle again, softer now, steady in a way that once seemed impossible. The Dawson home, once silent, hollowed by years of grief, had come alive with small, ordinary sounds. The hiss of the kettle in the morning, the creak of the floorboards outside Natalie's room, the sound of Ryan's laughter drifting in from the garden as he tried, and failed, to fix the old bench by the maple tree. Natalie had moved back, slowly, hesitantly at first, unsure whether she could ever call this house home. But Michael never rushed her. He simply made space, one small kindness at a time, until she began to fill the silence herself. Her room overlooked the water, the same view Isabel had once loved. At night, she'd sit by the window and watch the lights reflecting across Lake Washington, the world quiet, whole. Michael had retired from day-to-day operations at Dawson Technologies. His time was now devoted to something new, a foundation named Isabel's Promise, created to help children from foster care and guardianship systems find education, stability, and safety. Every child deserves a name that's truly theirs, he said during the first press conference, his voice trembling only once. Ryan had taken over many of his father's corporate duties. He worked longer hours now, not out of ambition, but to rebuild something more personal, trust. He visited schools through the foundation, spoke with volunteers, and learned, slowly, how to forgive himself. The guilt never vanished entirely, but it had begun to change shape, less of a wound, more of a scar that reminded him of who he refused to be again. As for Philip Crane, justice had finally found him. A quiet but relentless investigation had followed Natalie's revelations, and by spring he faced formal charges of fraud, embezzlement, and guardianship abuse. When the verdict came, she didn't attend the hearing. She didn't need to. Some victories didn't need to be witnessed to be real. One gray morning, Michael suggested a drive. Natalie and Ryan didn't ask where. They knew. The cemetery near the water was almost empty that day. Isabel's grave stood beneath a willow, the stone simple, elegant, engraved with her favorite line, "Love endures all things." Michael knelt, brushing the fallen leaves from the base of the stone. His voice was steady when he spoke, yet every word carried the weight of decades. "She's home now," he said softly. Natalie stood behind him, the wind catching her hair. Ryan beside her, hands buried in his coat pockets. No one spoke for a long while. They didn't need to. The air was filled with the quiet peace that comes after years of waiting, when pain no longer shouts. It only whispers, gentle and true. As they turned to leave, the first drops of rain began to fall, light and cool against the earth. But by the time they reached the car, the clouds had already begun to break. Sunlight spilled through, glinting off the wet stone and the surface of the lake beyond. The rain faded into gold, the city shimmering beneath it, a reflection of all they had lost and all they had finally found. And for the first time in 20 years, Michael Dawson allowed himself to believe that redemption wasn't something you chased. It was something that one day simply arrived and stayed.